Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
The Goods and Services Tax Amendment Bill will codify into law the government's plans to increase GST from the current rate of 7% to a rate of 9% over 2 years. The Workers' Party has opposed this increase and continues to do so. Nevertheless, in the spirit of advancing the debate, we have offered a number of what we believe are credible alternatives to the decision to stubbornly plow ahead. I previously shared with this House about why raising the GST is not ideal. To reiterate, perhaps ad nauseum, I spoke during the budget debate about why raising GST was unnecessary given alternative revenue options available. I followed up in an adjournment motion about how fiscal policy should not undermine our efforts at tackling inflation by increasing the headwinds that the economy faces. More recently, I explained in my speech on the Income Tax Amendment Bill why a temporary postponement of the GST hike, while clearly second best to not doing anything at all, would nevertheless allow the government to better fulfill its promise of addressing inflation that was higher and more persistent than expected. Now, you would think that I would have nothing else to add to this topic of GST, and yet I do. Today, I wish to suggest why a temporary postponement of GST on essential items, in effect allowing for additional exemptions in the amendments in Section 16 of the Principal Act, has much to merit serious consideration. While this is, in our view, unambiguously inferior to some of the alternative revenue generation strategies that the Workers' Party has previously advocated, it may offer an important stopgap measure that affords precious relief to our people at this time. To be clear, the government's decision to implement the GST increase in an incremental fashion rather than in one fell swoop has been welcomed by both businesses as well as many members of this House. However, it is notable that even back in February, some consumers remained skeptical. And this sentiment has probably been further compounded by the continued erosion of purchasing power in recent months, due to stubbornly persistent inflation. There's a strong likelihood that the increase in GST will further feed this inflation monster. In principle, this need not be the case. Tax increases could well dampen overall demand and thereby tame rising prices. But if taxes end up raising the costs faced by firms, they could instead end up constricting supply and then give rise to price increases. Now, that's in theory. In practice, we have often observed increases in inflation following the introduction of value-added taxes, such as the GST. The example I had previously shared with this House, the case of Japan, is instructive here. Japan increased its version of the GST thrice over the past quarter century. Each time, the inflation rate would more or less double for up to a year thereafter. Now imagine a doubling of our inflation rate from our current already unbearable levels. Now, to be completely fair, it should be noted that Japan's hikes occurred in a much more benign inflationary environment, which could have amplified the effects of the GST hike on inflation outcomes. It is nevertheless difficult to envision conditions where the impending GST increase would not give rise to another bout of inflation. To be fair, the government has tried to get ahead of this possibility by convening the Committee Against Profiteering. The committee is tasked with investigating feedback on unjustified price increases in essential items, while using the GST hike as a cover. Yet the task in front of the committee to effectively adjudicate cases of profiteering when the global inflation environment has itself run amok seems nigh well impossible. After all, how can we reasonably expect the committee to successfully disentangle the share of the price increase that is attributable to profiteering from a 1% GST hike, when inflation itself is already running at more than 7 times that rate? DPM Wong has explained that the government believes that it is, and I quote, more responsible, unquote, to proceed with the GST increase, even amid the uncertain inflation outlook. Mr. Speaker, given what I had just shared, one could just as easily make the case that it is just as irresponsible to do so, at least at this point in time. Inflation has hit the hardest in the categories that are often excluded from the so-called core measure of inflation commonly targeted by central banks, which is food and fuel. Yet these self-same goods and services are, not coincidentally, also frequently the most visible ones to the average consumer. While the MAS officially targets a different definition of core, which excludes private transport and accommodation instead, these categories have, likewise, been among those that have experienced the greatest bouts of price increases in recent times. Food prices, overall, have risen by 6.9% compared to a year ago. But in certain categories, this increase is more stark and significantly greater than overall food inflation. The prices of fish, for instance, have jumped by an average of more than 10%, prompting another member of this House, Mr. Melvin Yong, to fret that if this trend of existing expensive fish would continue into the future, while also he speculated on that, excuse me. It also makes it harder for the wallets of those of us who are trying to heed the call of healthy SG to improve our diets. Another Hokkien saying says, "Bo hu hei ma ho." Literally, no fish, prawns are good too. Yet in April, the price of prawns jumped by a whopping 14%. Now, the cost of utilities has jumped by more than 16%, with electricity in particular shooting north of 26%. This has led to shock and dismay among others, my Sengkang residents, some of whom have come to us during Meet the People sessions to ask for relief from overdue utilities bills, which they are finding difficulty in paying. The culprit of high utilities prices is, unsurprisingly, the high cost of energy. High fuels prices have also reared their head in transport costs, which have increased by around a fifth. We can, of course, lay the blame on the feet of the Russo-Ukrainian war. But the fact is that many are facing sticker shock when they book a Grab or a Gojek because they are late for an important business meeting. So, while Singaporeans accept that inflation is very much a global phenomenon, the reality is that inflation has inevitably become a tax on our people. The government has tried to assuage some of this pain arising from this inflation tax with a range of incidental measures, such as issuing additional USAVE credits, rebates, SNCC credits, and CDC vouchers. The prices of public transport options have also been mostly kept in check. Such additional support, to be clear, helps. But, and especially for lower income Singaporeans, including those that reside in Sengkang, appreciate this relief. Yet those patches appear piecemeal and inadequate, since they cater to the average household within each income group. In our walkabouts, incredulous residents have come up to me and asked, how can inflation only be 7% when my tag bill has gone from $3 to $5, and my SP bill has doubled? Herein lies the conundrum. Nobody is truly average, and so those who consume a narrower basket of goods and services will feel the pinch more acutely. This leaves many individuals and families feeling like the coupons, subsidies, and rebates fail to make up for the magnitude of the price increases that they face. Their worries are compounded, since by definition, spending on such necessities is seldom viewed as optional. But there's a simpler way to temporarily exempt these categories of essential goods and services from the GST hike altogether, since these categories have been subject to the greatest price volatility in recent months, and given the enormous pocket share that such items command in the average household's budget, it is reasonable to offer temporary, targeted, and relief for these essentially non-discretionary aspects of their spending. My Sengkang colleague, He Ting Ru, has previously made this case during her speech during the annual budget debates. This government has countered that such a multi-rate GST system will benefit higher income households more than lower income ones, making exemptions regressive. This is by and large true, although under normal economic circumstances. But we're not in a normal economic environment, are we? Inflation is a generalized rise in prices and affects us all. GST vouchers and U-Save rebates targeted to the lowest 2 or 3 quintiles of our economy leaves our large and beleaguered middle class in the lurch. Recall, taxes paid by such households will tend to be nominally higher, assuming that they were lucky enough to receive a salary adjustment this year. Yet they would have been left without most of the additional support measures that have been targeted at the lower income groups. This then amounts to a real tax increase, even before the GST hike. Moreover, as Ms. He has also pointed out, even if a system of exemptions turns out to be regressive, keeping the existing system of no exemptions may be even more regressive, since the pernicious effects of GST on the incomes of the poor may well be greater than the benefits of raising more revenue from the rich. The other common argument is that multiple rates will complicate our system, raising compliance costs for businesses. But surely the current patchwork of credits, vouchers, rebates, and subsidies is even more complicated to administer. Furthermore, Ms. He also stressed that modern technology essentially means that only a few additional lines of code are required to ensure that scanned barcodes apply differentiated rates. Surely our revenue collection systems are at least as sophisticated as those in advanced economies such as Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, all of which, along with emerging economies such as India, Indonesia, and South Korea, employ some form of differentiated GST regime. And compliance is, after all, limited to only the largest firms. In my earlier speeches, I had explained how short-term macroeconomic conditions warranted continued support from easy fiscal policy, of which a postponement of the GST increase would be a form. Today, I wish to also touch on how some longer-term structural changes likewise lend credence to the notion of a temporary delay. The Ministry of Finance had previously estimated that healthcare spending for the current 5-year period between 2021 and 25 was expected to increase by 0.5 percentage points of GDP. As it turns out, total expenditure by the Ministry of Health for fiscal years 20 and 21 busted this budget. It grew by 3.5% of GDP from 2.2%, which is little surprise given COVID-19 related expenditures. But those were extraordinary expenditures which were funded in part from our reserves. Hence, if we now allow the rate of growth of healthcare expenditures to revert to its original trajectory of a steady 0.1% increase annually, we still have wiggle room to forestall an immediate increase in GST. After all, the 3.5 billion that a 2 percentage point GST increase is expected to raise will amount to about 0.7% of current day GDP, which is far greater than the projected increases needed by MOH for the couple of years ahead. It strikes me that a postponement of GST for essential items will not have any significant detrimental effects on our fiscal balances and can eventually be made up in the future. In contrast, a delay will make a substantial difference to families who are bearing the brunt of expensive necessities today. Importantly, such a move will provide relief for even families not covered by the GST voucher scheme, who nevertheless face the same price increases that we all do. Finally, it's worth pointing out that the current setting affords a precious opportunity for evaluating how a differentiated GST regime would affect tax revenues. MOF has either not conducted studies of such a possibility, or if the ministry has indeed performed such analysis, it has never disclosed its evaluations publicly. A temporary postponement of GST for selected basic necessities will offer a pilot that would allow the MOF to recover some real-time numbers for how the differentiated GST regime would operate in practice. This is in the spirit of the usual approach that this government adopts to pragmatically test options that present themselves, to determine if it is a policy that is worth adopting, and to calibrate the scope of the policy accordingly. I see I have a little bit of time yet, so I will just touch on a few points in rebuttal to arguments made about why some of the revenue options that we suggested are not quite tenable. One argument that has been made is that property taxation would not raise quite enough for the purposes of offsetting the needed increase in GST amounts. This is in fact true. In our own calculations, we estimate that the amounts raised by changes in the property tax regime would raise a non-trivial amount of about 0.4 billion, but still insufficient. The crux of where we think we can raise an additional amount comes from property sales. Now, just to be clear, the way that we compute property sales does not suggest that we are taking recurrent, permanent revenues and using it for recurrent purposes. Rather, as we have explained, we're using the government's own treatment of land leases with tenure of less than 10 years, which currently gets directed to recurrent revenues. And instead, we're saying, let's be consistent and take the full amount of the 10 years, whether the tenure of the land sales is for 30 years or 60 years or 99 years, and instead take that amount and put that into our recurrent revenue. This will raise in excess of 2 billion, which is a big part of where this revenue strategy would raise the necessary funds. Likewise, on the issue of corporate taxation, it's important to note that our proposal of relying on respecting the terms of the OECD BEPS agreement essentially just operationalize what would be necessary to an agreement for which we are already a signatory. In fact, we will not touch SMEs, and our estimates of a net revenue increase are not ours alone. Others, such as Mr. C, who wrote in the Straits Times in February 28th, pointed out how BEPS was unlikely to hurt competitiveness and may net Singapore net gains in revenue as well. Finally, I should point out that on the issue of reserves, it is just as possible to oversave as it is to undersave. Based on our calculations, we calculated that when the government adjusted its NIRC contribution in 2008, it moved from about a contribution of 10% to the current 50%. Now, was it undersaving then? Would our proposal of going from 50% to 60% necessarily mean that we are still undersaving, or are we oversaving? I think these should all be kept in mind. Mr. Speaker, inflation has hit Singaporeans hard. While some may cope better than others, higher prices affect everybody, businesses and consumers, rich and poor. Raising the GST is more than likely to exacerbate these inflation pressures that our citizens already face. I should point out, however, that there's one entity that is comparatively shielded from this rise in inflation: the government. That's because taxes are collected as a percentage, many taxes are collected as a percentage of the taxable base. For example, if a business raises prices in response to higher costs of raw materials, it will earn more revenue in dollar terms, and hence its greater nominal profits will now be subject to corporate taxes, even if the tax rate remains completely unchanged. Similarly, GST revenue will automatically be higher in dollar terms next year, even if it does not increase from the current rate of 7%, because GST will be levied on the higher sticker prices already being charged for goods and services. This is why I had stressed in my earlier speeches that the government has a responsibility to rebate fiscal surpluses that have resulted from inflation.
You have 45 seconds left.
Yes, and the government has announced 2 and now recently 3 packages which amount to, still in our calculations, less than the 8 billion more that excess revenue that have been raised in the most recent fiscal year. So, Mr. Speaker, for reasons outlined in this speech and earlier ones, I cannot support the increase in GST. Let's not shackle Singaporeans with yet another chain around their ankles when there are alternative ways forward.